Okay, so the next point is the topological solution to the boundary problem. If you start out with a field view of panpsychism, where the universe is a gigantic field of consciousness, then you have the boundary problem, which is, okay, if we're all one, if we're all this gigantic field of consciousness, how come you are there and I'm here? Aren't we all the same field? The solution that we have here, the field is effectively something like a vector field where, there's kind of like arrows at every point. And there's many formulations here and many ways of arriving at field topology, but this is a relatively simple one that aligns with the electromagnetic field. And there are things you can do to the field that changes the topology of the field with electric oscillations, vortices in the magnetic field. The core idea would be something like, how in the sun, these plasma tubes, but you have these protuberances. When a solar flare happens, when the sun kind of like spews, like millions of tons of hot plasma into outer space, that is the result of a topological transformation, a macroscopic topological transformation, which is very significant. Most people tend to think, well, maybe topology matters at the microscopic level, maybe at the level of atoms and molecules. But what we're saying here is that the field topology actually has macroscopic top-down effects. And the way in which this happens is that, the flux tubes will be kind of like trapping plasma, but then if they touch, then the magnetic field lines exchange partners. And then when that happens, you essentially kind of like release these trapped plasma, which was what's called topologically confined by the shape of the field. That is a good example of the sort of thing that I suspect is happening in the brain. Something deep and very fundamental for being awake or dreaming, effectively conscious, kind of like as a unified moment of experience. The macroscopic neural oscillations are causing these electric oscillations that result in looping structures in the electromagnetic field. And these looping structures, they're not epiphenomenal. The moment you actually make these looping structures and you trap energy, then you have the resonant modes inside these looping structures, and you have this holistic behavior. You have something that behaves as more than the sum of its parts, especially as I will touch upon in the end, if you add something like a path integral formulation of like what is going on with light and electrons moving around in these pockets. You do have kind of this emergent, holistic, more than the sum of the parts behavior with objective boundaries that are causally significant. They have like computational properties. And we think that is what solves the boundary problem. These looping structures is what is creating an inside and an outside. It would be wonderful if this is the case because it solves so many philosophical problems all at once. The next point is electromagnetic field topology modulation. If indeed, something like the coupling kernel is modulating the way in which electric activity of these oscillators, the relative phase between them as a function of the distance, what happens is that you can use the coupling kernel not only to determine how sprinkly or how uniform the traveling waves or the chaotic processes in kind of these like oscillatory dynamics are, you can also use the coupling kernel to modulate the field topology. If you apply on-off center surround lateral inhibition type of coupling kernel, you may get lots of different vortices, or maybe kind of these nested structures of vortices that then are going to be trying to interact with each other and minimize the energy, but in this very exotic topology. Whereas if you make all of the oscillators go up and down at the same time, then instead, as a consequence, what you will have is just one gigantic vortex, or sometimes not even a vortex. Especially if you have a clear boundary or like a circle, for example, and you have this macroscopic coupling kernel that goes up and down all at once, that actually may erase the internal topology and make it entirely flat, which effectively maybe subjectively corresponds to complete ego dissolution. There's just no manufacturing of internal boundaries, maybe associated with a full, complete mystical experience. Just to recap, you can modulate the electromagnetic field topology with a coupling kernel. And importantly, the way in which the field topology will be modulated by a given kernel depends on the geometry of the network. Again, there's going to be some characteristic ways in which the oscillations in the electromagnetic field will be tuning into field topologies, which is going to be different than what is happening in the somatosensory cortex or the visual field, all depending on the particular network geometry of these subsystems. And of course, then where it becomes really non-trivial and fascinating is how they couple to each other, how they project onto each other, map onto each other. This is where, okay, we might be really starting to get kind of like a lot of traction for like how a drug causes these crazy effects on the field in a reliable, predictable way. Why 5-MeO-DMT may actually be reliably something that, for example, causes topological simplification. On 5-MeO-DMT, oftentimes people report, maybe they become kind of this huge torus, or sometimes they just become a point, or just a big pinwheel. Maybe they feel kind of like all of their attention field lines, as it were, like become perfectly aligned. That effectively maps onto something like a topological simplification process, where you have like fewer vortices than you used to have. And there's going to be a characteristic kernel here. And what we want to find out is to see if we can square something like the divisive normalization low-level effects together with an understanding of the network geometry and topology of different subsystems in such a way that we can, predict and generate the same visual and tactile phenomenology that is actually reported by people who, have experience with 5-MeO-DMT. Even if it doesn't work out, even just as a wide blue sky attempt at marrying third-person neuroscience and first-person taking phenomenology seriously, finally, you have like one way of creating a bridge. Even if the bridge is completely wrong, I still think it's very worth it, and it's very much a milestone, a new way of thinking of how to tackle this problem.